I have only exposed the gateway publicly, and now I could start adding more and more services and just configure them here. Hey guys, it's Peter from DevMentors, and welcome to the final 12th episode of Building FeedR Microservices.NET 6.0 based series. And in this episode, we're going to take a look at the basic deployment of our microservices based apps. So, how can we deploy our microservices? Well, I guess that most of the developers, engineers out there would probably tell you Kubernetes, right? Because the Kubernetes seems to be the king, and there is like a lot of tooling, a lot of libraries, plugins, extensions around the Kubernetes. And there is a good reason that things actually went this way. Seems that pretty much Kubernetes took most of the market and is the king, and it doesn't seem that is going to be replaced by anything in the near future, right? So the Kubernetes usually is the way to go. However, in some scenarios, especially let's say when you begin with the orchestration, when you begin with learning, studying, playing around how to deploy your microservices, sometimes it can be a bit overwhelming because let's be honest, right? This is a very powerful but also rather complex tool. And even if you are using some additional extensions, managers, for example, very nice tools that you can run on top of Kubernetes, like Rancher, which is great for managing this. You have a very nice UI, lot of features, and it's actually quite easy, I would say, to manage the Kubernetes. You still need to have some knowledge, at least you should have some knowledge with the Kubernetes, what it's doing behind the scenes. So it can be a bit overwhelming. And sometimes you just want to quickly test how your apps are behaving before you, let's say, go full blown and deploy to Kubernetes. So we'll take a look how we can use our Docker containers that we already have, how we can use our Docker files to build our Docker images, and then deploy to some kind of bare metal / on-premise virtual machine running Linux, some kind of Linux server, for example, Ubuntu or whatever it is, and then run on top of it the Portainer, which is a really cool tool to actually manage our containers. All right, so we'll try to push our microservices to the Portainer. Portainer is a very nice, simple to use, yet rather advanced tool that you can use as a basic, simple, like I said, still very nice, very feature-rich orchestration engine for your microservices. It's easy to use, it's free to use, you can make use of this community edition, and all you need is to have the actually container runtime on your machine, and you can start using the Portainer. So in our case, what we will do is to set up a new Linux machine, the virtual machine. We'll install the Docker there, we'll install the Portainer there, and we'll see how easily we can publish our microservices to the Portainer and how we could expose our microservices to the outside world or to the publicity, so that the other consumers, let's say the users of the internet, could start using our great application. So the first thing that I will do, and I actually did it already, is that I created this new virtual machine. So in our case, I'm using the DigitalOcean as a sample provider, but you can find plenty of providers out there. I actually really like playing with on-premise bare metal sometimes. I don't always use, for example, Azure or Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud. Sometimes I just like to have a bit more control on what I'm doing. So especially back in the old times where there weren't many cloud providers or it wasn't that popular, running something on-premise or on bare metal was the way to go. But I still like to do this, so just to show you how it works behind the scenes and how easily you can set up your own virtual machines without a need to pay, let's say, additional costs for the cloud providers. And you can easily set up your own virtual machine with Docker, Portainer, or even later on Kubernetes or other orchestration engines for actually rather small cost, like $5 or even $10 a month. It doesn't cost that much. So I have my virtual machine here. There is my IP address. So I can simply jump into my terminal and I can just log in through the SSH to my virtual machine, since I have already added my key to this virtual machine. So I'm in the virtual machine already. And the first thing that I would do after logging into, let's say, this Ubuntu server would be to install the Docker. So you can find, like, once again, lots of tutorials how to install, for example, the Docker on the virtual machine. So typically it's just running a few commands, updating your repositories, pulling the official Docker package, running your Docker installation through the dedicated Ubuntu or actually Linux distribution general. And after a while, you should be able to just type Docker on your virtual machine and you will see that there is your Docker up and running. But as you can see now, I have no containers yet. So let's jump back into our Portainer, into this installation guide. And here you can take a look that I will look for the Docker standalone installation, installation on Linux. And well, as you can see, it all boils down to something as simple as, at first, creating the new Docker volume. Okay. And now I will just run this Portainer. So it will simply pull the latest version. It will map this volume, this local Docker volume, and it will also actually connect to the Docker engine so that Portainer can actually manage your local Docker instance. So I will simply take this commands and it will also expose these ports. This one will give us this very nice UI to use to manage our containers through the Portainer tool. So let me just copy and paste it here. And I have already downloaded the Portainer on this virtual machine. So if I type docker ps now, I should see that there is my Portainer instance. All right, so I should be able now to get back to the browser and navigate to my virtual machine IP address. So I can copy this one and I can do something like 9443. And of course, by default, this will be exposed under HTTPS. So you should set up your HTTPS, your TLS encryption, and you can use, for example, Let's Encrypt to generate a free certificate, and for example, set up your custom domain along with it. So it's also rather simple. But if you just want to play with it, you could either disable this, let's say forced HTTPS redirection, or just like I'm doing right now, just continue to this unsafe website, but in our case, let's say we are totally safe because we have just installed this and we are the only users of this Portainer. So we should be good to go. Now, let me just provide here some dummy password to begin with. And now I will create this user. And here I am on my local version of the Portainer. Now, what I will do is I will click on this Get Started. And as you can see, since I provided this Docker sock binding, I am now connected to my local Docker instance, so I can see this local environment there. Currently, there is just one container available here. So what I will do next is that I will try to somehow push my local image to this virtual machine. Now the question is, how do I do it? Well, I will do this by making use of so-called container registry. So whenever you work with the Docker, and for example, if you were to go to the hub-docker.com, right, you can find a lot of images there. So let's say, for example, I'm looking for something like Redis, all right? There is my Redis image. Or I'm looking for something else, right? Let's say SQL. There is my SQL image. So this is like the public repository of the images. So I want to set up something private for my own needs. And I can do this with DigitalOcean's container registry. I can do this with Azure container registry. There's a lot of cloud, public, private providers that you can use to set up your own container registry. So let's see how we could actually push the local images to the containers. So since we have the Docker file per each service, aggregator, gateway, all the services, we have Docker files there, what I could do is something as simple as, at first, I would build my Docker image. So for example, I would type something like Docker build, then point to my, let's say, gateway Docker file, right? And then I would tag it with, let's say, FeedR gateway. So I would build my local version of this Docker gateway image. Once it's built, I would have to tag it with my container name, with my container registry alias. So once my local version is built, what I would do is something like Docker tag, and then I would like to, for example, tag my FeedR gateway, my local image, with this container registry name. So in this case, this, and then let's say FeedR gateway, like this, okay? And finally, I would have to push this. I would like to somehow push this local image. So push this local image from my FeedR gateway to this container registry, right? So it's also easily achievable. It's built to the Docker engine. It's been built into Docker engine like for many years now. So I would just do Docker login. And when I log in, I would have to provide to which registry I'm actually going to log in. So I would log in into the official registry digitalocean.com in this case. Now I would have to provide some credentials. So in my case, there will be just some kind of the access token that I can generate through this provider. And now I would just type something like Docker push, and then, for example, provide my full image name. So I would like to push my local FeedR gateway image to my private container registry. So if I were to make this push command, this would send this image to this registry. And now I could use the images from this registry within my Portainer, or maybe later on even within my Kubernetes instance, or in whatever orchestration engine I want to use, which supports, for example, Docker containers. So I have a few microservices already pushed there as the images. So now let's jump back into our Portainer and let's see how we could use this. So at first, I will jump into the registry section and I will add the new registry. All right, I want to connect to the Portainer my custom private registry. So I will call this one FeedR as the registry, and I will provide once again the name of our registry, which is this one. So let me just put it there. And of course, I want to provide the authentication credentials because this is my private registry. So here I am just going to pass this token, which you can see I have already saved this one. So in this case, in case of the DigitalOcean, I will be using the username and password, the same values based on my access token. In different providers, you might have separate username and password to access your private container registry. So let's just add this custom registry. And now let's jump into the containers, or maybe let's jump into the networks. Let's create a new network. I will call this one a FeedR. As you can see, this is pretty much your Docker manager, just with this UI, this user interface on top of it. So I'll create this new default network called FeedR because I would like to put all our FeedR microservices within this network. And now finally, I will jump into the containers and I'll click add container. And instead of choosing the one from this public Docker Hub, I will select as registry our FeedR. And here, let's just add the gateway. So I will make use of our FeedR gateway latest image. All right, so as you can see, it will even give you this nice autocomplete where you can choose between different images, different tags, different versions. And what is important that is at first, I want to connect my gateway to my custom FeedR network. I would like to set up my restart policy, let's say, to always. And most importantly, I would like to publish some kind of port. So I know that internally, my Docker will start at this default 80 port, right? Using this Docker environment. So here, I will map my host port. So I'll map, let's say, the public 5000 port to the private 80 port, which is the port on which our container is accessible within this private Docker network. And now let's deploy the container. All right, so after a while, you should see that our gateway has been deployed, and in the logs I can see is up and running. So now I should be able to actually access our virtual machine at port 5000, and voila, there's our gateway. So we have just exposed our public gateway quite easily, and it's being fully managed by the Docker runtime along with the Portainer as this user interface management tool on top of it. So we can do pretty much anything with our gateway. We can easily recreate it, remove it. We can recreate it with pulling the latest image, and so on and so on. However, if I were to do something like, let's say, FeedR and then Timecodes, of course, this will give me back 502, because when I make this request, now our gateway, as you can see in the logs, it tries to proxy this request to this internal Timecodes URL. And the reason it will fail is, of course, we haven't started our FeedR Timecodes microservice yet, and it tries to proxy to this specific URL with this kind of alias value, because within our Docker settings, within our app settings, we have specified that there is this specific app settings Docker JSON file. So within our Docker file, we said we want to use the ASP.NET Core environment being Docker. And here we said, all right, so when I publish Docker image and when I use this environment, I want to override my default app settings with the settings found within this file. So this is actually the reason that our gateway tries to reach this specific URL based on this app settings.dockerjson file, which is loaded based on this ASP.NET Core environment Docker value specified in this Docker file. So now let's try to run our Timecodes, and let's see if this is going to work. So what we would do now is something like containers, and then we could go into our add container once again, and we would switch to the feeder. And of course, just to be certain we have the proper names, I would use the Timecodes. So keep in mind, we have to use the same name as this one. So this is the proper alias, this one. But we need to add something additional here. So at first, I want to add this to our custom network, all right? But there is more. Besides the listserv policy, I would also like to include the Redis connection here, because in our app, if you remember, our FeedR quotes microservice actually connects to the Redis. So if it cannot connect to the Redis when it starts, it will fail, right? So if I were to try to create this container now, this would fail. And one more thing, since we don't have the appsync Docker.json here, and we have specified, we have kind of overridden this endpoint, these URLs, we have hard-coded these app settings there because we've been playing with gRPC protocol in other episodes, so we have kind of overridden these URLs. So we'd also like to specify that our container would run on port 80. So we could either make additional app settings Docker.json file like we have added here, which we would certainly do at some point, or we could override the settings for the Redis and for the endpoints, for example, by using the environment variables. So before we move this container, let's at first create the Redis container. So before we finish our Timecodes and before we'll be able to not only reach the gateway, but also reach the Timecodes via gateway, let's at first add the Redis container. So I will create the new container named Redis, all right? I will make use of the public Docker Hub registry. And as you can see, if I type Redis there is the official Redis image, the same that we are using locally. So I will just use this as our Redis instance, as our official Redis database based on this official image. So I want to pull the Redis image from the Docker Hub. And of course, I want to connect this to the feeder network so that our gateway and our microservices can actually connect to the Redis. and I don't want to expose this publicly. I only want this to be sort of exposed internally. I don't want someone from the outside to be able to access, to ping my Redis instance. So I'll just start Redis this way, and let's just deploy this container. And you should see now that our Redis is up and running, which is great. So now we can move back into our FeedR definition, and within this env, let's add two new variables. So the first variable will override our default Redis settings. So in order to override the settings, we can do the following convention, which is, let's say, built into the ASP.NET Core and actually into this configuration provider in general. So I can do Redis and then double underscore and then connection string. So now I will override my Redis double underscore connection string value, not which is currently localhost, and I will change this one. I will override this one to the Redis. And the reason that I'm setting the Redis as my connection string value is because we have just created the new container named Redis. So this will be used as an alias to talk to our Redis instance within this private Docker network. And the next settings that I want to override is this one, the Kestrel endpoints HTTP. So as you can imagine, we'll need to do something like this. And the URL for this one will be HTTP and then let's say 80. So let's save these two variables. And what is also important is that, as you can see, I will not publish my microservice publicly. So that once again, we want our microservices to be only reachable through the gateway. I don't want to publish my microservice publicly, let's say to the end users, to any user out there. I want to keep it hidden. I only want my end users to be able to talk to my microservices through this public gateway. This is also why we added the gateway in the first place. So let's deploy this container and let's take a look. We have our FeedR. It started. So the good news is that it was able to connect to the Redis. And let's take a look now. Let's refresh the gateway. It works. And if I hit my FeedR, it will also work. So I cannot reach my FeedR by not using gateway. I can only talk to my FeedR through the gateway. So this is great. I have kind of hidden my Redis instance and my microservice behind the gateway within this private Docker network. I have only exposed the gateway publicly, and now I could start adding more and more services and just configure them here. And this is really, of course, a glimpse of what you would typically do to set up your whole microservices system, right? Just to make sure you have your infrastructure up and running, that you have properly configured databases, and that you have backup in place, and all these important things, not to mention some configuration, secured access, authentication, and a few other things. But I would say, if you are working with microservices for the first time, or maybe if you have rather small system to begin with, maybe instead of jumping directly into the Kubernetes, or let's say Redshift or some other orchestration engines, maybe it's better to just start slowly to see how the things work, how these containers work, how the networking does work, and whether maybe this will be enough for you, at least to begin with the MVP of your app. And when you need it, you can just move into more advanced tools. And I would suggest, for example, using the tool such as Rancher, which is actually built on top of the Kubernetes. And this is a very, very nice feature-rich tool when it comes to managing your containers, including the enterprise software. And it's also for free for the community. So definitely, if you are looking for something more advanced, more feature-rich than Portainer, and more feature-rich than just Docker, which is one of the container runtimes out there, but there are also different ones like Podman and a few others, I would definitely give Rancher a try, or just, do the doctorate, do the PhD with the plain Kubernetes, but this might be a bit overwhelming. So just to keep in mind, and as you can see, start slow. Portainer might be a good way to test your system setup, test your microservices, and maybe this will do the trick for you, at least for the for some time whenever you start building your new microservices solution, or maybe for some testing purposes. This could be also beneficial to just start with this smaller orchestration engine and then move on towards something much bigger. So yeah, that's pretty much it when it comes to these basic deployment possibilities. As you can see, Portainer is a very nice tool, and it's been developed for many years now. It has its free community edition, but you can also apply for some additional commercial enterprise support if you really need it. So I would definitely give it a try, especially when you maybe have a bit of smaller system, when you, let's say, don't have this strong DevOps/DevSecOps culture in your organization. So something to begin with to see how your microservices are going to behave, which can be also pretty easy to scale using, for example, Portainer and these stacks component. So yeah, definitely worth trying, easy to manage, nice UI. So make sure to give it a try maybe before you jump into the Kubernetes. Like I said, if you're going to do Kubernetes, and you probably will at some point in the future, if you are going into, let's say, the real enterprise-ready big organization and microservice deployment stuff, definitely check out the Rancher, which I remember I've started using it many years ago when it also supported other orchestration engines, not just Kubernetes, for example, things like Cattle and a few others. Now it's mostly pure Kubernetes, so definitely give this one a try. And since this is the final episode, I just wanted to thank you all for watching, for staying here with me for this 12th episode. And yeah, I'm aware that what we have talked about is mostly just some smaller part. We just talk about different concepts, different tools, different patterns, and we could spend another 1,000 or even many more episodes to talk about more and more microservices related stuff. And I guess that from each episode we could pretty much extract out an additional course about message broker, about correlation, logging, observability, HTTP, synchronous request, YARP gateway, and all these things. So that's definitely the truth, and I'm not trying to convince you that after these 12 episodes you're going to be a microservices master, but the reason is that at some point we need to stop, and so that we can move along with some new series, with some new videos, maybe touching more in depth some of the concepts that we have, for example, just briefly mentioned within this FeedR series. So just like, for example, Darek has recently started this messaging series, which, we talked about this briefly, what is messaging all about and how we could use it for our needs. But to talk about it in depth, well, this would take us a lot of time. So definitely, if you are interested in messaging, check out the current messaging in distributed systems series being recorded by Darek. So that's it. Thanks for watching once again. See you in the new series, new episodes about the different topics. And yeah, subscribe if you haven't already. Check us out on Instagram and other social media accounts. And see you guys.